Good morning, everybody. We're gonna start the third day, in fact, of our conference. I'm very happy to be the discussant of this panel with Gulshin Lelandès, Soraya Al-Kahlawi, and Azam Khatam. We're gonna start with Gulshin Lelandès, who will be presenting on the contentious politics under neoliberal urbanism. We'll be having Turkey, then we'll be having Iran, then we'll be having Morocco in this morning session. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Before starting my presentation, just 2 minutes, I would like to dedicate actually my presentation to academics for peace, which are oppressed and persecuted in Turkey by Turkish government, and especially to Mehmet Fatih Tıraş, who committed suicide after being dismissed by his university. So I dedicate really this presentation to all these colleagues. Let's start now my presentation. Since the beginning, actually, of the 2000s, a number of international protests, demonstrations such as anti-globalization movements are emerged. These movements contesting the impacts of global neoliberalization over time began to focus on cities and to scrutinize current urban governance, increasing precarization and socio-spatial segregation of cities. For example, during the European Social Forum that took place in Istanbul in 2010, a handful of panels on the theme of the right to the city brought together activists and residents from different neighborhoods that were either destroyed or under the threat of destruction. The objective was to discuss the possibility of creating a common urban movement. And Gezi Park protests emerged in this context against a background of established urban social movement networks. And before this uprising, actually, occasional mobilizations and campaigns had taken place dealing with topics such as the over-exploitation of environmental resources, for example, in Turkey, also environmental degradation and destruction of historical buildings, forced displacement due to large-scale development projects, labor issues in different sectors, and, of course, human rights. These protests, however, were barely visible in the media, despite this regular presence in public space. None of these protests seemed to find large support in the society, and they remained limited to intellectual circles and specific professional groups, such as planners and architects, aware and concerned about the neoliberal exploitation of urban and rural space and the environment. And also to those people who were directly impacted by the urban or regional development projects. Gezi Park actually became the nodal point that brought together different motivations and different local social movements, and thus made visible an urban movement that had been developing since the beginning of 2000s. These movements also contest the lack of democratic participation in everyday life and the strategies of restructuring the city. They criticize actually the spatial and temporal concentration of urban development projects to the detriment of other urban problems concerning a large number of inhabitants in different metropolitan cities in Turkey. Sorry. Examples of some neighborhoods help to better understand actually how the movements engage with the political authorities in these movements, and thereby the struggle around Gezi Park is revealed as the result of the accumulation of the mobilization efforts of these various movements. What can we say about the beginning of the Gezi Park protest? While mobilization around Gezi Park during the first half of June took a peaceful and festive character, actually, Here I am referring a little bit to the presentation of Asef yesterday, because there was a huge difference between the protestation in Taksim Square and poor and marginalized neighborhoods, especially in Istanbul, Ankara, and the other metropolitan cities of Turkey. And the most violent struggles actually between police and protesters were continuing in these neighborhoods. And especially, for example, people killed during the Gezi Park protest were in these neighborhoods rather than in Taksim Square. At the beginning, actually, there was this discussion about the nature of Gezi Park protest as a bourgeois middle class movement, and on the other side, in the neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, the real struggle, the real contentious actions were taking place against the AKP government, against the police, and against the whole political system in Turkey. Well, if we have a look, about the Gezi Park, until the evening actually of May 27, 2013, Gezi Park was the only green zone, as you can see on the wall. It was only the green zone in the middle of a highly urbanized tourist district of Istanbul, and did not garner any particular interest from the majority of the inhabitants passing by this park. Badly maintained, and the park was used inter alia as a shelter for homeless people. It became the target of attention thanks to emails that started to diffuse by different organizations and associations in order to protect the park, because the municipality started to fell down some trees in the park. Starting from 27 May, the mobilization around the Gezi Park began. At the beginning, unexpected, this mobilization did not emerge from nowhere, actually. The project for the replacement of the park with a reproduction of a historical military barrack, which was to house a shopping mall, you can see just in the middle of the park, actually, they were planning to construct a shopping mall and residence and a hotel. And this project was worrying activists interested in urban planning, architecture, and urban transformation for more than a year. And this project actually was announced in 2012, and especially the Chamber of Architects and Engineers started to bring people together in order to create an association which called Association for the Protection and the Embellishment of Gezi Park, founded in November 2012. Well, they were trying to make some actions and mobilization, but it didn't work actually, and it's really the felling down of trees which makes start actually the mobilization in 27 May, and on May 30, the Turkish police intervened at 5 a.m. In the park to evacuate protesters from the park. In addition to the massive use of tear gas, tents were burned, and the park was opened to the bulldozers to continue demolition. After that, the demonstrators of the park numbered more than 20,000 by the end of the day, and several thousand individuals were still walking from different areas of Istanbul trying to reach Taksim Square. And by the night of June, protesters conquered Taksim Square entirely, actually. They started to occupy the square, and this occupation continued during 15 days. And even it was really interesting, because after the occupation of the park and Taksim Square, there were some comparison with Paris Commune, actually, in political terms, but also in terms of the fact that any police, any governmental forces could come to Taksim Square and Gezi Park and trying to, to stop the mobilization. It was not possible. For many people, the destruction of Gezi Park represented the ultimate attack of neoliberal urbanization in Istanbul, following many others, as the objective was to transform this small city park into a for-profit shopping mall residence area. Both people who criticized neoliberal town planning for neglecting democratic participation and those who rejected the imposition of conservative moral values regarding how to dress, how to behave, and what to drink in public decided to act in Gezi Park protests. So it is really a protest, not only a protest against urban mobilization, a little bit water maybe. Against neoliberal urbanization, but also against the whole political system in Turkey, actually. They were explaining that as a kind of authoritarian neoliberalism, polished by Islamic motives, which is characterized by a neoliberal individualistic consumer culture, by the construction of hundreds of shopping malls all around the country, and the spread of credit card and mortgage systems in the course of the previous decade. It is particularly based on the promotion of large-scale urban development projects and the gentrification of several neighborhoods where poor and marginalized populations are displaced in favor of newly created urban centralities. The initial resistance organized at Gezi Park had a clear urban agenda to reclaim the right to the city of ordinary urbanites who rely, according to one of the participants, who rely on use value in the city and to place it over the right to the city of capitalists, developers, and their allies who recast the city as a locus of exchange value and capital accumulation. This neoliberal character of urban planning was recognized by the protesters who chanted the slogan, "Capital be gone, Gezi Park is ours." In the discourse of many activists, the right to the city and spatial justice appear as fundamental elements of the protest. Well, if we have a look at the background of this neoliberal urbanization and neoliberal system in Turkey, the introduction of neoliberal economic rules started in Turkey during the 80s by progressively reducing state control of the markets under the rule of former Prime Minister Turgut Özal. And after Turgut Özal, elected after the 2001 economic crisis, the AKP government, AKP Party of Justice and Development, introduced new measures in order to overcome economic and financial problems the country was facing and to reintroduce economic growth. The objective was really to reintroduce economic growth, and the government was looking for a tool for establishing this economic growth in the country. And the tool was actually founded in the urbanization and to making the promotion of construction industry in order to really inject the economic growth in the country. During the AKP's rule, cities in Turkey have become central to the continued reproduction of a neoliberalism itself, and geographic targets and laboratories for a variety of neoliberal policies aiming of increasing the value of land. This includes the creation of financial centers, the building of shopping malls and tourist attractions, and the construction of luxury gated communities. Some recent projects like the construction of a new presidential palace in Ankara, the third airport in Istanbul, or the big development projects like Kanal Istanbul, for example, reflect some common characteristics of this neoliberal urban regime that could be summarized as follows. In this neoliberal urban regime, the main actor is the state and the institutions of state, especially the mass housing administration, which will manage actually all urban development projects in Turkey. The second characteristic is that these large-scale development projects, and especially the urban transformation, will be the main tools of city restructuring. Third, the subsequent realization of land rent embodied in the newly built environment of the city is one of the main objectives. Fourth, the urban transformation and urban development projects are considered as catalysts of economic growth and of the creation of new conservative capitalist class close to the government. 5 minutes, okay. So we can now pass to the different forms of contestation of neoliberal spatial order in Turkey, especially the contestations which are reclaiming the right to the city and spatial justice. And I think that all these movements and resistance are largely linked and started especially from 2004. And the most important mobilization was maybe the Gezi Park. But after Gezi Park also, there were a lot of mobilization, and especially I think the tradition to contest this neoliberal urbanization in Turkey with some neighborhood movements gave really the power to the Gezi Park protests. In Turkey, urban movements actually composed of two complementary components. On the one side, we can observe some associations and professional organizations, and on the other hand, we can observe neighborhood resistance and some platforms and movements created by neighborhood inhabitants in the neighborhoods. And I actually want to talk about two neighborhood resistance, which were really emblematic and important. The first one is Sulukule resistance. Sulukule, a neighborhood with a Romani community in Istanbul, represents one of the first examples of urban movements in Turkey, and it permits us to understand how the concepts elaborated by Henri Lefebvre, especially conceived space, perceived space, and right to the city, were entirely used by the activists themselves and by the inhabitants, and they tried to really give their own definition of these concepts of right to the city inside their movements. The Sulukule project started actually in 2006 by the municipality of Fatih. And inhabitants in the neighborhood were not aware about this project. It's only Istanbul Chamber of Architects and Engineers informed the inhabitants about the project of the municipality. And after that, some of the inhabitants actually come together to create Sulukule platform, the platform of Sulukule, in order to take part to the negotiations on this project. And in order to prevent the forced evictions. Sorry, my English is not very well actually. Prevent the forced evictions. Even as I have only 2 minutes, what can I say about the Sulukule resistance? Even the mobilization of Sulukules Romanis was not entirely successful. Actually, they distracted entirely the neighborhood. You can see here the new buildings. And they evicted actually the most of the Romani from the neighborhood and installed them in the newly constructed houses. It gives a hope and also an example to the other urban social movements in Turkey. And one of them was actually Tarlabaşı Beyoğlu's transformation and resistance. Tarlabaşı and Beyoğlu is just next to the Taksim Square actually. And this is a non-Muslim, at the beginning in the 19th century, it is a non-Muslim neighborhood. And there was minorities like Jews, Greeks, and Armenians in the neighborhood. And after 80s, actually, it is Kurdish people coming from the southeast of Turkey, and also undocumented migrants from Africa and Syria who will really invest the neighborhood. And after this, the area was stigmatized as the home of marginal groups such as transsexuals, prostitutes, and drug dealers. So Beyoğlu municipality tried to develop an urban transformation project. And in this case also, homeowners and tenants created a neighborhood association and succeeded to negotiate with the municipality. Well, I can't give the details of this resistance. I have no time. But I wrote an article about all these things, and you can find it on my academia page, so you can have a lot of information about that. And in the conclusion, I will conclude. In conclusion, the Gezi Park protests actually included many claims dealing with urbanization policies and democratic participation. It is true that at the beginning, the urban question becomes dramatically important in this mobilization, but also this mobilization transformed with the time to really the contestation of the political regime established by the Party of Justice and Development. And beyond the claims for individual freedoms, the Gezi protests expressed an opposition against the political and spatial orders determined by both Islamic and neoliberal values, and a request for a new ethos of the city. We can have, you can see some slogans on the slide. The tags like that actually invented during the occupation of the park illustrate the rejection of the current forms of spatial organization of the city and the desire for an alternative vision in the metropolitan cities of Turkey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gülşen. Please, Azam.
I'm happy for that. My paper examines the impacts of decentralization and rescaling of the state on the social movements in Tehran, with a specific focus on right to the city movement. In recent years, Tehran is witnessing an unprecedented growth of urban activism, despite the rule of conservatives, Islamists on the municipal administration. Such activism includes campaigns for urban environmental issues and actions to protect green and built heritages against a speculative, aggressive real estate sector. It also includes social support for informal settlers and street vendors who are resisting against eviction, who are protesting against unsafe workplaces and failures of government to provide urban services and infrastructures. Such activism benefited from the intense conflict between the central government and Tehran municipality. Also factional politics and different groups and gaps between them in the Islamic government. The fruit of mayor-centered decentralization of the 1990s, which ended up in the localization of the political life in Iran. This activism is embedded also in the achievements and failures of the political mobilization of 2009, what was called then Green Movement. This paper examines strategies of the urban activists in Tehran since 2012. This year marks the different signs and possibilities of existing from exceptional securitized conditions imposed by the government to curtail the continuance of the green movement. These strategies call the state in to provide the urban infrastructure and push it back by claiming the power of decision-making on local issues. Urban activists interact with each other with using the language of right to the city and use this language to bridge both poor survival strategies to repossess the space and middle class groups' actions against fraud and irregularities intensified by mayor-centered decentralization. To analyze this activism, the context of localization of political life in Iran should be addressed briefly. The economic stagnation rooted in the revolution, sanctions, 8 years of war with Iraq, the drop of the oil prices in international market, all led to a widespread consensus among different factions of the Islamic Republic to consider the rescaling of the state task and retreat at the local level. The Municipal Financial Self-Rule Act was ratified in 1986 to respond to government fiscal deficit. Islamic Republic has faced a governmentality crisis also after the death of Khomeini and ending the war without achieving promised goals. Islamic left was trapped by the failures of the Islamic economics. New political realignment opened the way for central right among Islamists to engineer a dramatic shift in the economic policy and intervention of its own technocrats and elite experts to craft a new liberal or invent a new liberal development agenda of its own type. In absence of figures like Rafiq Hariri in Iran, the post-war reconstruction relied on borrowing from World Bank and IMF. The building the market economy from the scratch, which was ruined in many aspects during the revolution. Tehran urban renewal, as in Beirut, was the case show of a broader reconstruction project, promising the rise of a scarred city and a scarred society, of course, in a different context. Iran's search for reforming urban governance in the late 80s coincided with an era which most states in the global south were adopting development strategies which emphasized the centralization and empowerment of the metropolitan areas as engines for national growth. In 1989, the first issue of a new economic magazine, which was launched by those central right elites, titled Tazehay Iqtisad, published an article featuring an illustration of a patient laying on a stretcher so bloated with illness that the medics carrying him were wearing gas masks. This body was titled Tehran. In the early 1990s, economic technocrats frequently invoked this medical metaphor of an ailing body in their description of Tehran. The representation of Tehran as a sick body aimed to represent the city as requiring official intervention for its cure and replaced the discourse of rejection of the city during the height of the revolution as the epicenter of the Pahlavi regime. The image informed the understanding and mobilization for an urban reform in Tehran, a complex and multi-layered transformative process that eroded Islamic revolutionary urbanism and composed processes of neoliberal wording urbanism. Repeatedly naming the reform a symbol of modernity, Karbaschi, then the mayor of Tehran, have used the metaphor of modern in different occasions to distinguish his liberal Islamic agenda from the conservatives' agenda, who failed to implement any reform during the two mayoral terms after him. He argued that none of them had the courage to break away from bureaucratic routines or had any utopic vision. In his remarks, the modern is constructed through an interaction with a constitutive outside, the urbanized world, and modernity emerges as an inevitable technique for governing the complexity of contemporaneity, a representation which promotes a particular image of the spatial order. I use neoliberal wording urbanism for such modernization project to address three intervened aspects of Tehran's reform which distinct it from provincial modernization of the Islamic Revolution and the elitist modernization of Tehran under Pahlavis. All these modernization efforts were crafted or shaped by what Tanya Ali names the will to improve. But only the recent project has this wording and neoliberal character, which we will discuss in following paragraph. Inspired by Asian models of development and urbanism, this project relied on extreme commodification of the space to fund the public mega project like Nawab Highway, a project which I studied for my PhD dissertation, the Newton project, spectacular architectural monuments like Milad Tower. I have some picture of this monuments and the project in this slide. Exhibitionary functions like cultural centers, nature bridge, which you can see in this picture, and a continuous production of spectacular spaces which actually tries to make the city competitive at the image scale with regional and global cities. This urbanism is framed by, as I mentioned, a mayor-centered decentralization, which actually give the power and fiscal autonomy to the mayor in lack of central supervisory power. And we can follow up that central government actively contributed to the formation of this process by cutting the central budget without providing alternative finance sources for the municipalities. Comprising 55% of municipal budget revenues before the revolution, central government share dropped to 10% in mid-2000. Such institutional fixed emerged as a dramatic restructuring of the property regime and ownership rights and rearticulation of urban governance with the economy. Karbaschi had to choose between asking city residents and property owners to accept substantial tax increases and relying on the profits from construction investment. He chose the second option. Municipal revenues increased tenfold between 1990s and 1998. 3/4 of this revenue came from levying new fees on the extra residential and commercial construction gained through increased density permissions. Municipality financed its project through privatization of an urban skyline, first in the northern part of the city where the profit rate on real estate was higher than in all parts of the city. Selling public land on the market and forming public-private partnerships were other important policies in this transformation of the urban finance regime. Karbashi replaced Tehran's supervisory councils with consulting councils and turned the consulting members, usually individual experts, heads of professional firms, and university professors, into his partners and contractors on municipal projects. The industrial relocation project relocated 200,000 industrial jobs from Tehran in a 10 years period to decrease industrial pollution. One aspect of construction boosterism marked by increase of the number of high-rises which reached to more than 1,000 from less than 100 in 1990s. The second aspect included the building of mid-rise apartments, as you can see in this picture, in the central part of the city and all old neighborhoods. Actually, by undeveloped lands in the other areas of the city soon were built, and municipality turned to this old central neighborhood for the reconstruction project and permissions for the actually small scale gentrification by the owners. As undeveloped plots available for construction, in other words, were reducing dramatically, the reconstruction of the building in the inner city increased. In response to the such construction boosterism, the infusion of the low-rise apartment building into the old central neighborhood of the city actually followed by an influx of the residents, which left in previous years, especially in the first decade of the revolution, they left the inner city. So a repopulation of the inner city was in the agenda of the expansion of extra density policy in the old areas. The dramatic intensification, which we call it in Iran extra density policy, deeply affected the property rights and ownership rights in the city. We know from sociological research on inequality that unequal ownership of certain kinds of property engenders other inequalities. My research on Tehran supports this idea that property rights matter most for wealth inequality. The inequalities in property ownership tends to be more extreme and stable than income inequalities. The landlords in Tehran benefited from the extra density policy according to the size of their plots. This meant that larger plots received more extra density, and landlords and tenants who owned plots, smaller plots, actually receive less. The plots less than 60 to 70 meters actually were not allowed to reconstruct their buildings. The wording urbanism in Tehran was economically exclusionary. To order the city, municipality took actions against informal developments. In the 1990s, the demolition of the unpermitted new buildings around the city became the basic task of Police Sakhtaman, a police force of 4,000 members hired by the municipality in the late 80s to interdict of new illegal construction. The reactivation of demolition units was a major cause of urban riots in Tehran and Mashhad in the mid-90s. The informal settlers put in fire all the banks and state offices in the western part of Mashhad in 1993 and blocked the southern roads in the southern part of Tehran. They were arrested, jailed, or killed, but neoliberal strategists who put the plan in motion forced to step down in growing gaps, in the course of growing gaps between liberal Islamists and conservative and leftist one. The extreme commercialization declined the diversity of the housing units in the market, and the reconstruction boom was guided toward luxury condos and apartment buildings. These speculative activities rampant in the housing sector caused 3 jumps in housing prices. And at the end of the decade, actually, the housing market was killed by these speculative activities. Decentralization led to reorientation of municipalities from merely managerial authorities to institutions that are both the field for and the target of political struggle between elites and citizens. Such localization of political life, especially in Tehran and other large cities, has the potential for making urban policy making less bureaucratized as it has been under Pahlavi monarchy and Islamic Republic. Yet the overall outcome of such conflicting process depends on the extent to which social actors make claim to the city. The unprecedented growth of urban activism in Tehran started by the campaigns for urban environmental issues and actions to protect green and built heritages against the speculative activities. While the mid-90s resistance of informal settlers did not witness the support of urban activism, because there was not such activism at the time, the street vendors resisting against eviction in 2015 and 16 are strongly supported by NGOs and students and urban scholars. We can follow such resistance at neighborhood level. In Ekbatan neighborhood, a complex of 17,000 units, for the first time, the community council sued the municipality for the change of the land use of a common land from green space to Darul Quran, and won the case in the court. Another NGOs, Nafas or Bird, actually launched a large campaign for public transport in Tehran, targeting both residents and municipality for more investment and more and change of lifestyles toward the use of the public transport. Other NGOs like Bahamistan, Yekshahr, and others followed the tracks of land grabbing in the city, unsafe workplaces, failures of government to provide urban services and infrastructures. Of course, such activism benefits from the rise of the conflict between central government, which now is in the hands of central right in Iran, or moderate or liberal Islamists, whatever we can we call them, and Tehran municipality, which is ruled by the conservatives. The coalition of the urban activists, critical urban scholars and planners who came together in fall 2016 to prepare themselves for the city council election, which is coming in next May, was an unprecedented symbol of rise of urban activism in Iran. Their agenda is to go beyond the politics of claim making, or mutalebe mehvari, as we call it in Iran, and introduce their candidates as the third force, distinct from the reformist and conservative candidates for the in the Islamic camps. Large group of activists have worked on policy papers and agenda during the last months. However, 2 influential members of the coalition were arrested last week. While candidates should register their names as for the candidature of the council till the end of the March. In coming months, we will witness if urban activism in Tehran and in non-democratic contexts like Iran find the chance to shape a major bottom-up initiative and move to institutional level of power, or should retreat to its minor project for intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So when I play, it's okay. It will play. You want to put this first? No, like 5 minutes.
You want me to show this up?
Okay, so when I want to show it, I'll play for it. It's okay. Good morning, everyone. So first of all, I want to thank the team of the City Debate for giving me the chance to present my work and also my documentary. I'm so sorry because my English is so bad, and it's my second intervention in English, so please, I will try to do my best. I will talk about a small struggle in Morocco, but a small struggle that means a lot for me, and I think it's a good example also to talk about how our kind of development and neoliberalism affects the inhabitants. So I will do a small presentation, and then I will show you some extract, like 10 minutes, and then have a comment on it. Being committed to modernization, Morocco is experiencing a high rate of urbanization as all the country in the Maghreb. The city is erected as a showcase of modernity and is taken shape under the auspice of international standards that are used as a pretext in order to privatize non-regulated land reserve as slums or collective lands. In this communication, I will start by the example of the privatization of the Guiche Loudeya land that is situated in the Moroccan capital, Rabat, in order to show how the modernity rhetoric underpins an extension of colonial logics of grabbing and privatizing communal agricultural spaces. More specifically, based on an ethnography of the inhabitants of Douar Ouled Lim claiming their right of housing, this communication will aim to analyze the form of resistance to the urban modernization. So in this communication, I will not be too theoretical, because also my English cannot allow me to, but also because I really think that we need to understand and face how inhabitants understand their situation and define also their situation and the eviction. So just one word for the methodology. The analysis of the data is extracted like from an ethnographic survey of residents of Douar Ouled Lim. The ethnography survey was based on a visual anthropology. I was following the inhabitants for like 3 years on the struggle. So I have made a lot of interviews with all families. And this material was collected over like 2 years, actually, until March 2014 and May 2016. And the opening of the documentary has been made in Morocco last week. So also I will, but not in this presentation, analyze the reception of the inhabitants of this documentary. So in my investigation, I have not take interview with like official or policemen, or I just focus on inhabitant, because as Erwin Goffman said, when we are in a conflict field, we have to take a part of one side in order to take confidence with the oppressed one, and that was like my point of view. Also because the official has access to the media, so like for my activist part, I was really willing to give the words to those who haven't access to public media. Okay, so maybe another just 2 words on the Gishludaya tribe. So the Gishludaya tribe is an old warrior tribe, and their land was given by a sultan in 2038, the Sultan Moulay Abdurrahman. In exchange of arms, he gave them the lands on Rabat. But when the colonial power arrived, it settled like a new legislation, a collective land, that deprived the inhabitants of their private property. So after the independence, this legislation was not removed, so the inhabitants of the Gishludaya lands are not proper propriétaires, owners, owner of their lands. The lands are in the hand of the Ministry of the Interior, and the inhabitants are only usufructuary, usufruitier. So that's this kind of legislation facilitates, of course, the land grabbing, because the Ministry of Interior can take the land and sell it or give it to a private investor. So the Gishludaya land are in Rabat, and they have been taken since the 80s in Morocco to build the highest and the pushest neighborhood of Rabat named Hayariyat. So let's listen to the inhabitants now.
السلام عليكم. اسم ديالي مراد، من مواليد 1986، مغربي، تنسكن بدوار ولاد دليم كيشلودايا. هي هاد الارض هادي ريبوا لنا الناس، كرفصونا. دابا حنا عام سنه وحنا برا خارج الشارع. شوفي الاستثمارات، شوفي الاستثمارات تبارك الله. ضرب استثمارات ليه، شوفي استثمارات مزيفه. هاد الناس جابوا لنا راقصات، جابوا لنا امن، جابوا لنا سلطات، جابوا لنا كلاب، جابوا لنا سيكوريتي، جابوا لنا بزاف، وكاننا حنا لاجئين، وحنا راه مواطنين مغاربه، حنا عندنا حق وشردونا، وحنا وسط الرباط. والبارح اقسم بالله تنغوتوا ليه عاش الملك والامن تيضربنا، تنغوتوا عاش الملك بالجد، وشاد الرايه وخدا ليا من يديا. ها كنت
جات القطارات ديال الارض وريبوا لنا الشجر ديال الجرده، عشينا في شجره كلها مثمره، فيها الحامض، فيها الشفرجل، فيها البرقوق، الزيتون، البنان، جوج البيار اللي بغيتيه كاين، الحامض. المهم شردونا وخلونا مشردين الى يومنا هذا. دايرين عندنا براكه، دايرين عندنا زريبه وهي راه ارض فلاحيه فيها 3 دكتورات. واش 3 دكتورات بالكواره ديالها وب8 المنازل ولا 9 المنزل اللي كاين فيها، والبشر شي 32 واحد عايش فيها. دايرينها زريبه حاسبنا مع هما اللي عندو براكه.
يلا بدر يلا نمشيو للبيت.
والبنات يخلفها والبنان هذا كله هو الولد هذا ابن الشيباني. ابن هذا تقولي هنا ابن الشيباني
110 سنين
فعمره 110 سنين. الراجل الكبير الشيباني هذا ولده ها هو عمره
هذا راه
62 عام.
هذا
راه ولا جد.
مشينا للبيت.
خاص نشوف الكبيره
هضر مع الكبيره فاش
حضرتي من جاو ريبوا لكم هنايا؟
كانوا معتقلين.
المهم في الاول في البدايه حضرت وفي الاخر يعني شي نص ساعه تعقلي انا والولد ديالي وداونا بجوج. هما دائما تيديروا هذه الحيله، دائما تعقلوا رب الاسره باش يتسنى لهم يقوموا بالعمليه كما يشاءون. هنا كانت الدار هنا ديال الاب تقريبا ما يسمى بالمفهوم السوسيولوجي الدار الكبيره، تضم تقريبا دار وحده تضم 8 البيوت، عاد الى جوارها واحد العدد ديال المحلات والاسطبلات وعدد ديال الاشجار والتجهيز ديال يعني ديال المحرك ديال ضخ المياه، وهذا اكثر من 20,000 شجره كلها دمرت، وحيدوا حتى الاثار ديال الجريمه، جابوا الشاحنات وجابوا كل شيء الجرافات وكل شيء باش ما يخليوش الاثار ديال الجريمه باينه هنايا. وهذا هو السبب اللي كان عندهم تيزعجهم هو هذا الموقع، لان قال لك عندهم حسابات خاصه باش هذا الموقع كان يزعجهم باش تبان لهم من هنا القضيه ويديروا البيزنس ويتفسحوا مع راسهم هنايا وطردونا احنا بالقوه. احنا راه لن نتنازل عن حقوقنا مهما فعلوا بنا، لن نتنازل عن حقوقنا، سنبقى نطالب بحقنا حتى وان كلفنا التضحيه ديال هذا الحق هذا، وسنتابعهم قضائيا امام المحاكم الوطنيه او المحاكم الدوليه ان شاء الله، لأن الجريمة يعني قاسية جدا. كيف يعني تعيش واحد المدة زمنية طويلة أكثر من 60 سنة أو 100 سنة فوق أرض ومن بعد تجرد وحيدوا لك حتى الهوية ديالك. دابا حنا صبحنا بحال لقطاء في هذا المجتمع. يعني
لك الكوميسير
أنا يا ودي حر، أنا يا ودي حر، بلادي راه تبنات وبلادي راه تبنات، أنا يا فين البيت، أنا يا فين البيت، عمرتوها بالفيلات، عمرتوها بالفيلات، مشاريع تاهية، مشاريع تاهية.
اللي كيتهدم ما تيبينوش في التلفازات وفي سميتو، تيبينوا لك غير الحاجه اللي غادي تهز، ما كيبينوش الحاجه اللي عاطله، ما كيبينوهاش. الناس اللي ضعافه وداكشي كاع ما تيبينوهمش.
يا العباد يا العباد يا العباد يا العباد، هذه هي البلاد، هذه هي البلاد، سموها حي الرياد، سموها حي الرياد، كلها مسروقه، كلها مسروقه، كلها مخطوفه، كلها مخطوفه.
طار الاستعمار الحقيقي وجاء الاستعمار من أبناء جلدتنا. نحن استعمرت هذه الأرض هي ديال المغاربة القيشيين،
الله يعاونكم.
استعمرنا من أبناء جلدتنا. وزارة بعد النافذين من وزارة الداخلية، مديرية الشؤون القروية، عمالة الرباط وتمارا، والمحافظة العقارية بالرباط وتمارا.
هو عيش محترم، عيش محترم. شي ندير جميع الحاجات. وزارة السكن والتعمير شنو الدور ديالها؟ إذا السكن المواطن، فين هو السكن المواطن؟ فين هو العيش محترم؟ هذا هو العيش محترم. سكن لائق، هذا هو لائق. عشة ديال الميكا لائق. هذا هو النمير.
وكان عندكم حانوت هنايا؟
كان دكان.
هو اللي كناكلوا منه، حانوت هو اللي كنتباعشوا منه. شحال هو عندي الحانوت؟ ملي درت تقريبا ملي درت العمليه صافي هذاك هو اللي كناكلوا منه، هو حتى هو دار عمليه. على الريه كان خدام بالموطور، ما بقاش خدام به، منعوا عليه الموطور، درنا داك الحويات كنتباعشوا منه كناكلوا منه. ولدي انا هادشي تعطى ظهر ولدي نهار تضرب الشركه ما عطاتش عليه الشركه، راه كنتعاونوا وياه. الحانوت جا ويدمولي لا خدمه لا سكن لا، فين غيمشي هاد المواطن فين؟ انا كنتو ملي طوقتونا بالبوليس وطوقتونا بالستيمي كنتو طوقونا بليسانس وتحرقونا من الاحسن، لحقاش ما عندناش فين نمشيو. مغربي في بلادو ما عندوش حتى حق السكن، ما عندوش حتى فين يستقر. ما كنطلبوش شي حاجه مستحيله، ما كنطلبوهاش. عطيونا غير فين نمشيو حتى حنا نتمعشوا، غير فين نمشيو نسكنوا حنا وليداتنا. وكنتو كتصوروا بلا هادشي يقدر يوقع هنايا في المغرب؟
عمرني ما تصورت انا المغرب غيجي واحد النهار يبدل المدن الصافي ما عشش ما غادي الناس بميكا. عمرني ما كنت كنتوقع، كنت كنقول المغرب غيجي واحد النهار ما غتبقاش مدن صافيه وغنوليو حنا دوله زعما كنقولوا حنا في تقدم. ساعه بالعكس حنا ولينا في تاخر، بالعكس حنا ولينا كنرجعوا اللور، الا حيدنا مدن صافيه ولينا دايرين العشش، والوليدات مساكن خارجين من تحت الميكا، بنيت هاد الباك خارجه من تحت الميكا حشومه.
وعلاش داروا لكم هادشي؟
اختي قال لكم بغاو الارض. الو مال مال ما شفتوش بنتي بنتي داك
تيحاربوا الأمية، تيحاربوا الرشوة، دولة الحق والقانون. هذه دولة الحق والقانون في وسط بلادك وفي وسط أرضك مهمشة. البارح تيهضروا في الأخبار على الانتخابات، تيروا تسجلوا في الانتخابات. أنا أصلا هذيك البطاقة التعريف، أنا البلاد اللي ما تعترفش بيا ما نعترفش بيها، على من غنتخب؟ حياتي كلها وأنا تنتخب، غير شفر على خوه. وقف معايا شي حد دابا من النواب، عرفتوا انت فوجو شكون هو هاد اللاعب هذا اللي ننتخبوا عليه ديما؟ واش هادو ناس ولا وحوش ولا اوباش؟ الحديقه عباد الله اللي فيها الحيوانات واعترفوا بهم وعطاهم حقهم، والبشر اللي هو بشر كرموا الله. نتكرم في بلادي، الا ما تكرمتش في بلادي وبكرامتي وبشخصيتي في بلادي ما نعترفش بهاد البلاد، عندي ما ندير بها.
ما كنطلبوش من هاد الناس شي حاجه مستحيله، يعطيونا غير السكن فين نخشيو ولادنا. ما بغينا فيلات، ما بغينا طوموبيلات، بغينا غير فين نستقروا
على السكن ديالنا.
So this is it. So I will have just a little bit commentary about these images. So as you might know, the city of the south are now subjected to competition rules. That's why they have to maintain an accelerated pace of development. So big projects are taking place in the city to build a new economic activity. And what is very interesting for me to analyze is that in this context, the modernity or the post-urban modernity creates a new urban world, and this new urban world in actually, for me, reconfigurate the colonial or pursue the colonial logic of segregation between the way of life of like indigenous people and now modern people. So the racial segregation is now taking place in a new way, and this new way is like modern way, anti-modern way. That's also in this context that in Morocco in 2005, since 2005, Morocco is committed to this big program of UN Habitat, the city without slums. So making explicit reference to the Millennium Development Goals, the city without slums seeks reinstatement of all the urban slums of Morocco and the relocation of slums dwellers. And actually, it's very interesting to see that the state used this discourse to expropriate collective lands. We are talking about farmers and not slums. It's not that I'm thinking that we have to expropriate slums, but it's very interesting to see how the state used this discourse to accentuate the dichotomy between urban and rural, and this dichotomy comes from, as you might know, from the colonial logic. So the state is using a very specific legitimation of grabbing procedure, which involves the interrogation of the social question treated so by segments, and it's also take place in like the stigmatization of historical construction of any rural expression in the town. So I think it is very important to integrate this dimension, the colonial dimension, in the framework, not simply to describe the historical process of how this happens, but rather to allow to decipher how the public discourse has made the image of a pathological urban spaces for who it is, since it is pathological, legitimate to apply a policy of eradication. The dichotomy established, as I said before, between the rural and the urban, rooted in the colonial logic, has been created in the collective imagination two types of strictly sealed space whose spatial cohabitation is impossible. So in Morocco, we have like urban modernity, and what is not urban modernity has to be eradicated, because it's like shameful for Morocco to have such space like that. And so as Abou Lerod said, we are now shifting from racial segregation to class segregation, but not also, because for me, if we only said that, we also miss the reconfiguration also of the race, because these new spaces like Riyadh or also other big projects in Morocco are also set to allow the elite and the white elite to come to Morocco to invest. And so now in Morocco, we have Moroccan elite who behave like former colonial elites, former colonial people, like so white people, and the indigenous way of life, our traditional, or I don't like this word, but I don't know also how to not use this word, specifically in English. So sorry for this traditional thing, but our, yes, old way of life, or not modern way of life, has to be totally eradicated. And what is also very interesting, it's in this post-colonial like logic, it's also that it refers to strictly capitalist logic that is dispossessing farmers to build town, to build the urban city. So I think that also we can make a comparison between like the movement of the enclosure that take place in the 19th century in Europe, and what is happening now in Morocco and in other countries of the south. But what is also very interesting for me, it's the practice of resistance of the people of the Waroul Lim, because they form part of the struggle for the right to exist. So they are really fighting the invisibilization that the strategy of the invisibilization that the states try to do. And also what is very interesting, it's that the feeling of exclusion that they express themselves explicitly refers to what Henri Lefebvre theorized as the right to the city. So it's very interesting also to see people just telling theory without theory. This it. So how much time I have? It's finished. Okay, so just one thing. In all this context, I really think that the critical theory of urban have a special meaning, because it really allows us to to bring together the critical big theory that I have not said in English, but I'm sure that you know it also, so I think it's not besoin. And so the big analysis of critical analysis of the capitalism, but also in the framework of the post-colonial studies, and also an anthropological reconfiguration that allow us to understand better how people feel and how they are affected by the neoliberalization of the urban space. Thank you.
I want to thank the three speakers, and as my role as moderator and discussant of this panel, I'll bring forward some ideas to launch the discussion that I hope will be wide. With more or less emerging economies and heavy urbanization context, and the three countries we're looking on. But at the same time, they are very different politically in the sense of the regimes that are there. The word regime now is a very blurry term, so maybe let's say the political structure that is there when we think of the Islamic Republic of Iran, of Turkey, of Morocco. It's different systems, different contexts. So what does context really mean to the development of this political context? What does it really mean? What opportunities it gives and what limitations it gives to the development of these urban movements? I see, for example, that Azam has focused on decentralization as a moment, as also a certain, let's say, background that allowed the development of these practices and this organization. There's also clearly the, I don't know if we can call it tribal, but let's say ancestral links that bring people together when we look at the case of Morocco. And there's also the idea of the neighborhoods, and what Gülşen has provided. So these are very different kinds of contexts and different kinds of mobilizing urban movements. So what defines the way these movements get together and the way they get organized, the ways they get to learn? If we want to also question this central idea here, do they develop a learning? And it's clear that we have different contexts, so different learning practices. Some are more isolated than others in what we've heard. If you look at the case of Morocco, these people seem to have to be constrained in the way they articulate with other actors, with other international actors also, spaces to learn how to organize themselves. It may be not the case necessarily in Turkey or in Iran. So I would be interested to hear about that. I'm interested also to hear about who speaks in the name of the urban movement. Maybe the old person here that has been mentioned in the film in a more traditional pre-modern, to use your word structure, may speak for this community, this group. But what about other contexts where we have more activist kind of persons who are there? So this is just a question to launch the discussion. Would you like to start answering this question, or have wait for more questions from the public?
I believe this question on isolation of this, the question of isolation of these campaigns or incidents of eviction or resistance is really important, because in Iran case, or as I should say in Tehran case, because I don't know what other cities, we had 2 periods of resistance of the poor against eviction. In mid-90s, they were suppressed silently because there was no strong civil society, there was no urban activism. We were in a very dreaming period of post-revolutionary and reconstruction of the war period, and nobody cares about poor. We were fed up with the Islamic Republic's slogans and, housing the poor, everything about the poor. So middle class just was ignoring these incidents. But on the contrary, in the recent years, we have the same eviction processes going on, this time for the street vendors, and we can see a huge support among middle classes. And these activist campaigns actually bring or bridge these movements together. How and why this more broader mobilization around one specific group's claims or needs could happen is an interesting question. It doesn't really depend on the democratic situation in very conventional terms, because in the 1990s we didn't have less democratic situation than now. It's, actually we are experiencing a very hard situation right now in Iran. It's, I believe it depends on the experiences of the generations of each other, or the public that's shaped by the more general incidents like neoliberal agenda, which actually has been in place in 2 decades, and it actually linked and built solidarity among different social actors.
About your question of learning practices and who speaks in the name of urban movements, actually it's a tricky question, and I would like to say, even you said that all these movements are very diversified, very different, but there are also common points. But even inside the Turkey, actually, urban social movements are very diversified and very different depending on neighborhood. I think my presentation of Yaşar and the presentation of Tolga will be very complementary to understand really the nature of urban movements and urban resistance in Turkey. Because, in some movements, there are specific associations and organizations we observe, especially the Chamber of Architects and Engineers, for example. In Turkey, in the most of urban social movements, we are observing this organization, trying to make alternative plans, trying to negotiate with political institutions, political actors. But at the same time, we are observing also when the inhabitants themselves don't participate in the resistance, that they don't take themselves the action, the initiative, the movement is less successful. So this diversified situation is very important. For example, when we observe actually different neighborhoods in Istanbul and in Ankara, I observed, for example, that the resistance which was successful was really the one which was organized by the inhabitants' initiatives themselves. And also, of course, we should not deny the role of, as you said, the middle-class activists, urbanists, who try to bring a kind of resistance spirit in some of neighborhoods. Sometimes they take it is successful, but sometimes it doesn't work. This was the case of Sulukule, for example. Really, the activists from outside of the neighborhood tried to organize the resistance, but it was not successful from the side of inhabitants, and it doesn't work. But the Sulukule example give some experience to the organization of next urban resistance, and people learned a lot about from the Sulukule resistance and tried really to make something together with inhabitants. I think it was the objective of One Hope Association in Düzce and other areas. There is also one point that I want to emphasize, very specific to the Turkey's case. It's the existence of leftist neighborhoods. And the heritage of extreme left coming from 70s is very important in some neighborhoods. And these are the neighborhoods in which the resistance and the success of the negotiation with political actors is very, very important. So even there is not sometimes the support of external associations, this militancy heritage, this social capital existing in the neighborhood, we can name it like abeyance structures. It means that there are some militant heritage sleeping actually in these neighborhoods, and which is revealed during the organization of urban resistance. People who were very active during the 70s started to organize the community inside the neighborhood against the urban transformation, against the neoliberal urbanization, and change their discourses, political discourses, into a kind of alternative urban discourse. So it's what I can say about these learning practices.
So I'll try to answer in English. For the political context, I think it's a very, very good question, because this actually my work is on all the post-revolutionary context in Morocco since 2011 until 2016. So in 2011, there was like this big movement, 20 February movement, which takes place, and then we have the king have made a new constitution and then new election, our first free election. And after this free election, we have the first Islamist party take the government. It was the first time for this opponent party, and so for all the experts think that okay, in 2011 the Morocco do his democratic transition and the movement is falling. But it was really not true, because in 2012, just after the election of the prime minister, rumors came in all the countries saying that it's okay to build. So all informal settlements explode. It was very incredible, and a lot of riots take place in all the neighborhood in the periphery of the big city like Casablanca, Tanger, Rabat, Agadir, Marrakesh. Big riot came because the local authority tried to stop people of building, but people feel strong, very strong. So in 2012, it was like our revolution, or the revolution of the poor, not only for the informal settlement, but also for street vendors. And in 2013, the counter-revolution begins in Morocco. And because of the counter-revolution, the regime or the state feels stronger, and also have to rattraper, catch up to catch up the delay that he has taken with the program City Without Slum and all the international programs. So For the urban thing, in 2014, the eradication of slums, collective lands, estimated as slums, becomes, and it's very increases, and it becomes very, very violent. So also the opportunity for the people becomes smaller. So we can really see that it depends on the context, you know. If it's the revolutionary context, people are going in the front, and if not, they are like resisting. But what is very, very interesting, it's despite all the political context, there's one way to resist for the right of housing in Morocco, because there is no activist movement. The only way to catch up this right, the right of housing, it's simply to take it. So they take the land when the political context offer them the opportunity to
slip through.
Yes. And when the political opportunity doesn't take them, don't let them, they just occupy it, like for the Gishdaya. And this, for me, it's very interesting, also in terms of activism, because the leftist group, but also the Islamists, really don't care not so much about this kind of mobilization, because they estimate that this is lumpen proletariat, and lumpen proletariat is very close to the monarchy, and they are too vulnerable, so we can count on them. So maybe we can spend much energy in solidarity with this kind of struggle. And also they are afraid. And we see the strength of this kind of revendication and this kind of strategy. They are just taking their rights, and this is strong. And also it reminds me so much of what Frantz Fanon said in English, that the revolutionary will not the real revolution can only come if there is like a big link between lumpen proletariat and middle class in our post-colonial country, because only lumpen proletariat can constitute a counter-hegemonic culture of the modernity, and this is, I think, so true.
Thank you.
Thank you all for a great presentation. I think it's fascinating how the three show the power of donor agency terminology, like with Soraya and his presentation on cities without slums and how it's been co-opted in a negative way, but also Gulshan and Azam's presentations on the world city and this image that it has to look in a certain way. And also this other point of densification and how it's seen, density is seen as something negative, whether it's slums, probably in the two cases. But then what's happening is actually a densification. So this is, this has to be interrogated with planners and with governors. How are they looking at the city and saying, oh, it's dense, there's these slums, we have to evacuate them. But in their place, they're actually bringing in more dense the skyscrapers and the high-rises. But then it's a form of super gentrification. So you're moving the poor and not necessarily as dense people or population out, but you're bringing in a rich class that is denser and more of a strain on resources and so on. And it just doesn't fit. And this I've seen in the Cairo 2050 plan, for example, where they had a graph and scientifically showing that how the densification is going up and that it has to go down and these measures have to be brought in. But at the same time, in the same document, there's tens or hundreds of skyscrapers that are coming in. So this is something that I think in your work as urban activists, these need much more interrogation, holding people and officials at their word on this, because it's just too much of a paradox to just slip by.
Just a quick add-on to this is to ask the same learning question that you asked about how activists are learning from each other, about how economic and political actors are learning from each other. We saw many of this type of learning that Jackie is referring to before the revolution. With these activist responses, are we seeing also across countries a response from the political and economic elite and how they respond to these activists? We heard a little bit about this in Asif's presentation, highlighting reshaping public spaces. We hear a little bit about it in responses to street vendors, but is there a more macro level of learning that we're seeing being pushed out by some of the big players?
I'm just curious about what Zam said about the municipal elections, the coming city council elections. So are we looking at Podemos Beirut Medinati in Tehran, or is it just a few independent actors? I'm just wondering whether it's a movement or it's just a few independent activists. It's very interesting, and I hope it's that the bigger side.
Thanks, sorry.
Thank you. Politicians adopted neoliberalism as a model in governance which had a great impact on social, economic, and spatial levels. And here, different movements emerged as a result of the ramifications of neoliberalism. My question, shall the social movements target politicians or neoliberalism as a concrete structure for governance? And shall we consider these movements as a way towards a new structure for governance that can calm and redirect neoliberalism?
Okay, so from my perception of the different presentations since 2 days ago till now, I feel that I'm not really seeing the point of being a citizen, actually, because I see that the state is not actually giving us the basic needs, let's say in Lebanon, but also is really going against and taking away our rights eye to eye. So my question is that is this resistance, for example, or are these people, in the case that you showed us in Morocco, are they seen as a threat because they're autonomous, or is it just because, or is it just an acquisition of a way to get the land that they have acquired? Because in reality, this horizontal sprawl that's occurring is kind of unjustified in cities, because in reality there is this opportunity to actually go up vertically and densify. So, and this horizontal densification is not really justified. So for me, I see that maybe these people are a threat because they are autonomous in the ways of their life, and I see that the state is trying to make us more dependent on it through time, and taking away our knowledge of how to grow things, how to live in a certain way that we don't need the state, and this increased dependency is actually enclaving us, and throughout time, I just don't see I don't see why we should continue being citizens. So, yeah, I just want to know what you think of that.
Thank you. Just one quick note. The way we understand mega projects, I think we need to be more nuanced. Yes, they demolish resources, ecology, and evict people, but then there's also a very large social base that support these projects. And that's not because of the sort of illiterate and not enlightened citizenship, but they see probably a project behind or a vision for the future, which is not countered by the movements like us, that in terms of providing that vision for the future. So I think that this understanding of mega project requires a bit more thought. And the way, the meaning of the potentiality of urban uprising, like Gezi Park or others, we give a lot of credit to that, but we also need to see the limitations of such movements and the way in which the regimes or systems react back. And referring back to yesterday's Asaf's quote, anything extraordinary can be tackled by the state, by the police. We have to also see the extraordinary, not always in the maybe more inclusive way, but more exclusive in these movements. The extraordinary also allowed the very harsh demolition of the whole movements, and in Turkish case, now in the Kurdish city. The Gezi experience has been accumulated by the state as a new strategy to fully destroy the cities from the map, so that there can be no Kurdish Gezi. So that's, I think, limitations of the uprising is equally important as to see this potentiality and to be self-critical as well. Thank you.
Thank you for those presentations. This is a comment, but perhaps a provocation inspired particularly by Soraya's presentation. So I'm a little anxious about the ways in which in urban studies we continue to use the terminology of neoliberalization. Not simply because it's a rather Eurocentric reading of global capital, but also because it implies that certain resistance strategies are those that we have to foreground. And in particular, what the emphasis on neoliberalization does is that it obscures various forms of authority that are marshaled, right, by these regimes, but it also obscures various modes of capital accumulation, particularly that of expropriation. And I think Harvey rather inappropriately places expropriation in the realm of original accumulation, even though he says it's ongoing. But I think that precisely an emphasis on post-colonial capitalism or racial capitalism allows us to understand expropriation in much more expanded ways. So partly I'd like to hear from you, and I think also what it does is it allows us to think about the role of the state not just as the proponent of neoliberalization, but also as the proponent of modernization. Because in some ways the three contexts can be read as modernization as well. And that goes back to the comment here, because modernization carries with it a certain cultural hegemony that neoliberalization often lacks. So building on that, this is what I've been struggling with in the case of India, where I've been doing ongoing ethnographic work on the relationship between the state and urban citizens, is the ways in which it's precisely that modernizing capacity of the state that allows a reinscription of expropriation, evictions, expulsions as nation building, right? As future building, as worlding, as I've written about. But what it means is that alongside the right to the city movement, and I'm also a little anxious about our use of the phrase right to the city, there are also all of these demands on the state that are either in the more familiar idiom of patronage, right? Patron-client relations, requesting services of the state, demanding services of the state. And there are also ways in which urban citizens, even when being expelled or evicted, are negotiating for resettlement and rehabilitation. And my own work has been very critical of those forms of resettlement and rehabilitation and those sorts of demands. And yet I've got to recognize that that too is a political idiom and a repertoire perhaps of contentious politics.
Please.
Thank you very much all for all of these comments, for which I have not a full answer. Actually, I'm asking myself also on the relevance of this full structural approach of neoliberal global urbanization, planetary urbanization, especially on the point that when we focus I think, on the global neoliberal urbanization, we forgot sometimes the points of resistance against this neoliberal urbanization. Sometimes we analyze this system as it comes without resistance and as it is a full reality everywhere. It is not the case. When I try to compare, for example, neoliberal urbanization in Western countries and in countries like Turkey, it's all different actually. And in the countries like Turkey, Morocco, or Iran, I think it's also very nourished by authoritarian characteristics that we don't find actually in Western countries. That's why it is really different. And also, even the neoliberal urbanization exists in Western countries. It's also some tools of negotiations, empowerment, exist also in these countries. Even there are, for example, some theorists criticize this empowerment, also saying that neoliberal system injects some kind of empowerment and negotiation in order to avoid resistance. But in countries like Turkey, for example, there's even not this kind of empowerment negotiation or try to bring the demands of inhabitants in this kind of project. So I am interrogating also myself about this, what you are saying actually about the neoliberal system, which obscures some kind of main important points. And also what I want to emphasize one of the characteristics of neoliberalism in Turkey, of course it's a project of modernity, but it is also, in the specific case of Turkey, it is also a project of accumulation of Islamic capitalism in the hand of Party of Justice and Development, which has the objective of the creation of capitalist class close to its ideology, which was not the case before in Turkey. So I think it is very important that we are observing currently a kind of transfer of property and capital in Turkey, which is a kind of transfer, state-led transfer, so which is different, I think, from the Western countries also. And last point, it's the importance of politicization. Power of politicization of urban resistance. Just an example, I'm referring to active citizenship of Engin Işın on that. Sometimes inhabitants go beyond the urban resistance and take really action in political affairs of their country. For example, in a neighborhood I studied, people after their urban resistance presented a candidate for the local elections of their district. They presented a candidate for the neighborhood administration. So it really goes sometimes beyond the urban resistance.
The question on modernization and new liberalization actually is an interesting one. As Iranian scholar, we have a challenge to discuss the modernization because Islamic Republic should symbolize a non-modern government, and it just starts from the first moment of the revolution to modernize the country, to modernize the villages. So we are facing more than 100 years of modernization project. So we need to discuss the types of modernization during different political, socio-economic regimes that we have. That's why I try to use and differentiate between Pahlavis and Islamic provincial modernization the elitists of Pahlavi, the provincial modernization of Islamic Republic, and this neoliberal, more recent neoliberal agenda. I believe these are the systems which actually match together, work together, rely on each other to work. This neoliberalization in the spatial form shows itself in the extreme commodification and exploitation of the space. Densification is everywhere. As Yahya mentioned, that why the slogan, all the wording against slums as densified places goes back to the modernization of the welfare state, or in our context, developmentalist state. Those traditional, conventional developmental states, they all the master plans talks about, inner cities as dense areas. They should be relocation of the population, renewal, which actually push away thousands of people. But nobody in this new era talks about. We actually talk about in planning theory about compact city. We try to find a justification for this densification, and this densification actually is because of economic logic is very embedded in the planning now. I call this neoliberal, this embeddedness of the economic logic instead of the welfarist logic. The second point about Beirut Medinity, it's an interesting question. I'm following through last year the Beirut Medinity because I was involved in the situation in Iran. I was thinking what's going on here, how you do that. I know very little about your context, but to compare this, I will say that we have lived 3-4 decades with elimination of the left from political scene. So everything that's happened was conflict between different factions of the Islamic forces. For the first time, secular experts, scholars, activists are voicing, and they are trying to say that, okay, that's enough. We are talking about third force in this election. I don't know what will go on. We were kind of shocked last week with the arrest of these 2 people because it seems that, okay, government, there are many things going on there that they don't care much about city council. But strategies are changing, and we should see in coming months. It's a good research question for me. I hope that I have the chance to compare these situations with yours and learn more about from Beirut.
In City Debates 2018. You tell us.
Sure. Do you want to come out? 2 minutes, please.
Yes, so very quickly, maybe I can answer your question after. I'm very happy to hear you talk about this thing about modernization and neoliberalization because I finish it, but while I write my theoretical chapter, I was facing this problem because the concept of neoliberalization doesn't fit so good, not for me, and not for the case of Morocco, and I think not for the case of all the post-colonial contexts. So I'm also using the word modernization much more than neoliberalization. And of course, you know the debate between Vivek Shiber and all the subaltern studies. So people are people are going in like a big debate in theory about this thing, how we can analyze the capital and the capitalistic accumulation from the south. So I think it's a huge debate that we really have to have. I'm beginning, so I have no answer, of course. I'm trying to understand. But really, I think also that we have to,
we have to find our own way to analyze the capitalism, because the theory of neoliberalism and the theory of the urban neoliberalization really miss the point. Really miss the point also of this thing of citizenship, because they are always, the inhabitants of Gish today are always saying, واش حنا مغاربة, are we Moroccan? It's the title of the documentary, are we citizens? And this is exactly referring to colonization. That's why also I really want to put this this extract with this man saying that the lands are being colonized. It's not neoliberalized, it's colonized. It's not exactly the same thing.
Thank you, Soraya. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jihad. Thank you, everybody. I just want to say we're 40 minutes past the program date. So I'm going to ask people to grab a coffee, and really let's start in 15 minutes so we can catch up in